Hello, friends. This is Gabriel at the University of Notre Dame. I'm so grateful for the community we've built at exploring the Quran and the Bible. I'll be speaking today about a way in which there is an entanglement or maybe a conversation between the Quran and the Bible. The question of whether Abraham actually debates with God over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah, which, according to both the Quran and the Bible, are ultimately destroyed. Why do the Quran and the Bible have such different takes on what Abraham actually said to God and what God said back to Abraham? One of the hallmarks of this channel is serious scholarship, serious study of scripture. There's lots of apologetics and polemics and different sorts of clickbaity things out there. This is a place where you have serious academic discussions. And if you want to go one step further, I'd be really grateful if you become a member. Memberships are open right now for exploring the Quran and the Bible. There are two different tiers, and by becoming a member, you get access to member-only shorts. In those shorts, I'll be going into more sort of academic, controversial questions that scholars at places like this debate all the time. It won't be as much sort of like, the general chat about Islam and Christianity, but really academic questions about the Quran and the Bible. You'll also have access to video chats for members only, where once a month at least, I'll be meeting with members and I'll be, discussing with you, but also answering your questions about the field of Quranic studies, kind of cutting edge new trends in Quranic studies, and also the relationship between the Quran and the Bible. And I can tell you a little bit about my life story between the Middle East and the University of Notre Dame. So please become a member and please spread the news. Let's get on right away to that question of Abraham in the Bible and Quran. As I mentioned, this is an interesting case. It may not be super well known to everyone, but in Genesis 18, there's a remarkable story in which some visitors come to Abraham. That's the first part of Genesis 18. In its own right, that first part is an incredible story, which has all sorts of Jewish and Christian sort of traditions of interpretation, where these three men who visited prefiguring the Trinity. Why is Sarah presented, that is the wife of Abraham, as laughing at the announcement that she has a son? But in the second part of Genesis 18, we have another amazing story, which is how Abraham meets with God seemingly face to face, and Abraham takes that opportunity to bargain for Sodom, a city which has been the home of his nephew Lot, and which he knows is kind of set apart for divine punishment. In the Quran, however, this engagement or this meeting between God and Abraham is referred to, but in a very different way. So we'll be speaking about that. So those are the three principal topics of this pretty short presentation. I'll introduce Genesis 18 to you. I'll speak about the Quranic allusions to Genesis 18, and then I'll ask the question, why does it matter? Why does it matter that the Quran takes such a different take on Abraham's meeting with God? Okay, interesting. We'll see there on the right-hand side the important tradition of Abraham being called the friend of God. The Arabic word is Khalil. This is the name, not for nothing, in Arabic of the city of Hebron in Palestine, which is, of course, the home of Abraham's tomb. It's not only the Quran that calls Abraham a friend of God. He's called a friend of God also in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament. So there's a long tradition about this friendship with God, and one can see why. I mean, here we have an Islamic reflection on why he's called a friend of God. But this scene in particular, in which there's something like, although theologically it's complicated, a face-to-face conversation between Abraham and God, certainly seems to a reader or to a listener to invoke a special sort of friendship that he had with God. Let's go back to Genesis 18. Genesis is the first book of the Bible, and Genesis 18, as I mentioned, starts with the story of these three visitors to Abraham and the proclamation that he and his wife Sarah, although they're past the age of childbearing, producing children, they will have a child who is Isaac. And then the second half, the three men are alluded to there in verse 22. We read, so the men turned from there and went towards Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. I mean, already there's sort of a mysterious element, right? Because there were just three men in the scene of the first half of Genesis 18. But now we have a story, or an element of this story, in which the men apparently have carried on to Sodom, but God is still there. The Lord is still there. That's an allusion to the special name for God that's revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai. When we see Lord in capital letters, it's revealed later to Moses on Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus, but it's already used in certain strains within Genesis. So Abraham is there before the Lord, and then Abraham says to God, will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? And we can see already that there's a certain logic to the contention that Abraham is making. He cares maybe particularly about his nephew Lot, but the biblical author might actually have sort of like a deeper or more general theological argument to make here, which is something on the one hand about God and something on the other hand about Abraham, and maybe something about how humans generally following Abraham might make petitions before God. And this bargaining goes back and forth. Abraham thinking very diplomatically, and always expressing his humility before God, says, is there 50? Will you kill them? And the Lord says, no, if I find 50, I won't destroy the city. Abraham presents himself as dust and ashes. What about 45? He says. And, the conversation goes on until you get to verse 32. So over here on the right-hand side, then Abraham says again, listen, let me just speak one more time. What about 10? And at this point, God announces, even for 10, I will not destroy it. And then God goes on his way, and Abraham goes back to his wife, Sarah. Sorry, one more sip of water. So, the story itself sets up what actually happens in Genesis 19, because Sodom is destroyed. 10 are not found there. It also speaks to a special role that Abraham has in the salvation history of the Bible. God has chosen Abraham, that's back in Genesis 12, and called him to go to this new land, to Canaan. God has made a particular covenant, sort of a one-on-one covenant with Abraham, which is alluded to, among other places, in Genesis 15, and then again sort of renewed in Genesis 22, which is the story of the sacrifice of Abraham's son. So in part, what this does is sort of, throw a positive light on Abraham, but it certainly also is integrally connected to Genesis 19 and the story of destruction there. And biblical scholars will have other things to say about Genesis 19 as well. And so, for Jewish scholars, it has a particular place within the story of Abraham, who was a precursor to Moses and Abraham's covenant, which is a precursor to the Mosaic covenant on Mount Sinai. I just wanted to note that for Christian authors, all of Genesis 18 has this typological element, but also a sort of lesson for Christians. So the typology, already alluded to before, is that there are three visitors and God is somehow in their midst. This is the very famous icon of Rublev on the right-hand side, where the three visitors to Abraham are sort of figuring or typologically representing the Trinity, the Holy Trinity. So that is important there as well. But there's also this homiletic lesson about the love that Abraham shows, which for John Chrysostom at least, the early Christian father, famous for his the mouth of gold, famous for his preaching. The point of the Abraham story is that he wants to save not only the righteous, he wants to save the wicked. And if you sort of read through this passage on the left, you'll see it. He wants to save the wicked by means of pointing out to God that there are righteous there. So, I mean, you can see he did what he did, not for his nephew only, but for the people of Sodom also. He had the like concern for all. So that's an important point. There's also a lesson that Chrysostom draws about the nature of God, who's referred to as the righteous. We might learn how loving to man the righteous is. Nevertheless, this is interesting to us as we move towards the Quran, because it shows that in Christian interpretation already, there's this question of does God have love also for the wicked? And how does God's justice, the punishment that he exacts at certain moments in biblical history, correspond with the mercy that God shows at other moments and the love that God has for the entire world? So let's go ahead to the Quran. And here we notice a startling difference. Okay, very interesting. We're speaking about Quran chapter 11 here. This is Surah Hud, which follows the sequence of Genesis 18. So it begins with the visitors to Abraham and Sarah, although Sarah is not named. In the Quran, it doesn't name them at 3 visitors. It speaks of them as Rusul. But if you read sort of the earlier verses before verse 74, you see it's clearly Genesis 18 developed by the Quranic author in a particular way. The announcement of a son is made, Sarah laughs, and all of that. And then we get on to what corresponds with the second part of Genesis 18. And there's some massive differences that we find in the Quran. First, we have this reference to Abraham's fear subsiding, which is unique. And it seems to be that Abraham's fear that the messengers had come to punish him and his family, maybe his wife, he realizes that's not the case. And he's received good news, that is, of a son. And as we find, here's a correspondence in the second part of Genesis 18, so too in the Quran, Abraham begins to argue with God. So if you see that phrase there, he began to argue with us. That capital U indicates, that is, with God, about the people of Lot. Now, just to keep in mind for those who may not be familiar with sort of Quranic articulation or rhetoric, the Quran is presented as divine speech. So it's God who's speaking. So this would be God telling the story of his earlier conversation with Abraham to Muhammad and Muhammad's people in 7th century Arabia. Then we have this praise: Abraham was forbearing, tender-hearted, and devout. And if you remember the previous slide, which had that homily from John Chrysostom, which really emphasized the tenderness of Abraham for all, the just and the wicked, you can see some of that coming through in the Quran as well. But the stunning difference is that the Quran in verse 76 has God say to Abraham, turn away from this. Your Lord's command has come. It cannot be turned back. So there's no bargaining. There's no back and forth. There's no Abraham saying, I'm dust and ashes. Let me ask just one more question. There's a similar version in Surah Al-Ankabut, Quran 29. Let me pull up the Arabic as well for those who want to be able to see that at the same time. So in Quran 29, we have Abraham specifically saying, but Lot lives there. And then God is like, we know that, of course, and we will save him. So the Quran is different in that Abraham shows concern specifically for Lot. That's important because the repeating narrative of punishment in the Quran is only the righteous are saved and the wicked are destroyed inevitably. Now, this is a unique story. Some correspondence may be to the stories of Noah, because we see sort of God intervening and saving Lot so that all of the other wicked people in the city can be destroyed. Why is the Quran interested in that sort of punishment story? Presumably, for the Quranic author, it has a lesson or an argument important in the author's context, so 7th century Arabia, basically, which is get on the team of the messenger. God will destroy the wicked. He does not save the wicked. He does not have mercy on the wicked. He is Wali al-Mu'mineen, the ally of the believers. now the prophet is Muhammad, just as once the prophet was Abraham or Lot. So now get on Muhammad's team. Okay, just a little bit more about why this matters. And so if we think about what's going on for the Quranic author, well, he's modeling for the Quranic author a trust in God's judgment, but also a sort of disposition of firmness that Abraham at first resists, but clearly the Quranic author commends, which is God is opposed to the wicked or the unbelievers. And by telling the story where at first Abraham sort of complains about this or debates or argues about this and then reconciles himself to the divine plan of punishment of the wicked, the message to the listener is pretty clear that, learn from the experience of Abraham. Don't sort of be in the middle or think that you can sort of be in the camp of the unbelievers and the believers at the same time. One must be with God and his messenger. Now, it's interesting that Abraham fails to intercede or is told not to intercede for Lot's people. Elsewhere, there's a similar sort of phenomenon that takes place where Abraham wants to intercede for his unbelieving father. But here, Abraham fails or is told not to intercede for his people. Uniquely, however, the Qur'an suggests that one prophet can intercede. Now, there's some other passages usually associated with the Meccan period which suggest that all of the prophets can intercede. But the way that the Islamic tradition receives what the Quran says about intercession ultimately seems to be that it's just Muhammad. Muhammad is the one who can intercede. Quran chapter 4 speaks of Muhammad, even in this life, being able to intercede for the forgiveness of those around him. When the messenger asks forgiveness of them, then they would find that God accepts this. So that's really interesting. In a way, it shows that the role of Muhammad is much more, at least according to this passage, than the one who simply warns people of punishment or promises paradise. He has an active spiritual role in between God and the community. And then on the last day, in the narrations, here this is from the standard hadith collection, Bukhari, the narrations of the day of resurrection, Muhammad's intercession is really celebrated. I mean, this is interesting, right? Because they speak about folks who look for intercession from Adam and then Abraham, but he's the friend of God. And Adam says, no, I'm not fit for that. Abraham, no. So they go to Moses. I'm not fit for that. Moses actually says, go to Jesus, because he was created directly by God. Yeah. And Jesus says, no, I'm also not fit for that. You better go to Muhammad. And when it comes to Muhammad, he says, I am for that. And you can sort of look at the rest of the references there, but it's Muhammad's followers. He calls out, oh Lord, my followers, my followers. And once again, the message here, this is now hadith, not Quran, is be on Muhammad's team. That is the only safe place to be. Okay, just a few concluding thoughts. Is this difference between Abraham actually carrying out this bargaining with God or being told not to do so is just innocent or random difference, maybe different transmissions, or somehow the Genesis 18 story developed in a certain way, and in that way it was received by the Quranic author? I would suggest that it is not. That the way in which the Quranic version of the Abraham story differs from the biblical version corresponds with particular arguments of the Quranic author. So the Quranic author here and elsewhere seeks to sort of inculcate certain norms in the community of believers. And among these norms is a strong conviction that one must belong to the believing community to be saved. Maybe to be saved even in this life, because God could destroy people even now, as he did with the people of Noah or the people of Lot. but certainly to be saved in the afterlife. So your hope is to be within the community. And this is sort of shown by having Abraham rebuked to a certain extent, when Abraham at first seems to argue for the whole people of Lot. No, Abraham, argue only for the believers. God is the friend of the believers. God is the wali of the believers, not of the unbelievers. And this is connected to a larger phenomenon that to me is really key to understanding the Quran, that's not spoken about that much, which is community formation. Or if you want to be fancy, you can show off with other folks by using the German word Gemeindebildung, which means the formation of community, basically the development of a sort of coherence and a solidarity within the community. And that is often the aim of the Quranic author. The key, and we could think of a 7th century context, there's threats from Christians, maybe from Jews. There's incredulity out there. People are going back and forth. Maybe they have family members that belong to another community. And so, sort of goal number one of the Quranic author is to sort of solidify the new community of believers. I'm so glad that you're still here. Thank you for being here. As I mentioned, we now have exploring memberships. So I'd be grateful. Not only my appeal to you is not only that it's really worth it, which it is, because of the video chats that we'll be having and the exclusive YouTube shorts where I go more into detail about cutting edge questions, but also we'd be really grateful just to have those who are benefiting from this channel and those who believe in serious academic scholarship of the Quran and the Bible to become members of this channel, just to sort of give us some encouragement and some motivation to keep going, exploring the Quran and the Bible. Thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to having you back when we have our video chats for members only.